Live from the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences in beautiful downtown Raleigh, it's the Science Cafe with your host, Chris Smith.
Says we're out of the doldrums of winter, even though it's been spring for over a week. But, oh well, we'll deal with that later. But I hope you're enjoying your time here at the museum tonight. Give a round of applause for the Daily Planet Cafe staff, feeding you beverages. And by the way, if at any point you need a refill, go hit them up. You'll be fine. We'll excuse you to go get another drink here in the cafe. Tonight we're going to talk about the flu. I won't ask you if you've had it. I will say if you have it right now, please leave. And don't bring that up in here. Some of us still have to go to work tomorrow. And I don't want to have to deal with it. But yeah, we were talking before the cafe started about working at a big public space like the museum. You know, we work around a lot of kids in particular, but you know, 1 million people a year are coming through the doors of the museum, and some of us wonder how we manage to stay healthy for more than a month at a time with this many people going through. Because, right, that phrase going viral, it means, you know, reaching out, and it touches everybody in here. In fact, you know, everybody within about 15 feet of me up here talking at you, I'm sorry. There's stuff from me landing on you, and there's not anything that I can do about it. Can't swat them away, can't keep it from happening. Maybe I could be wearing, you know, a big respirator, and that would do it. But then you couldn't see my beautiful face. Oh, y'all are sweet. Y'all, thank you for that. Tonight is all about being prepared for the flu, and not just me being prepared to deal with kids coming through the museum that might make me sick, or adults too, but being ready for big events. And so our guest tonight is North Carolina's state epidemiologist with the Division of Public Health, Dr. Zack Moore. He's also going to be speaking and presenting next week at a symposium that UNC is holding called Going Viral, which is why I mentioned that before. So you can register for the symposium if this kind of thing interests you. Check it out. It's next Wednesday through next Friday at UNC's Gilling School of Health, I think, is where it's being held. So at the Friday Center, thank you, at the Friday Center. So if this kind of thing interests you, register, check out that. It promises to be very, very interesting stuff. And then next Saturday, April 7th, the symposium is actually going to bring itself to the museum from 10 to 3 a week from this Saturday. You'll be able to do some cool epidemiology-related activities in the museum. We'll have a handful of guest speakers in the Daily Planet Theater during the day. You can check out naturalsciences.org to see the schedule of events and get information on that. So at least come out to the museum in a couple of weeks and see us, and you can learn more about this stuff as well. Without further ado, I'm going to turn the stage over to Dr. Zack Moore.
Thank you. Here's my little clicker thing. Okay, well, thank you, Chris, and thanks, Katie, and thanks for everyone for coming out. I was just saying beforehand that it's really funny, you know, flu activity tends to peak pretty sharply, drop pretty sharply, and interest in flu drops really sharply after that. So we're right on the cusp right now where in about a week, no one wants to hear about flu at all until we hit the next season. So I'm going to talk actually a little bit more of a historical perspective since it's 2018, and 1918 was, of course, our biggest flu pandemic, at least that we know about in modern history. So I'm going to go through sort of a little bit of a trip through time, just sort of a comparison of where we were then, where we are now. So as far as where we were then, probably you've all seen pictures like the one on the screen before of these huge warehouse-like wards full of soldiers this one actually happens to be in Kansas. This was the first Army barracks to be affected by the flu pandemic, and possibly, depending on who you ask, one of the starting places. But this was, ultimately killed somewhere between 50 to 100 million people globally, well over 500,000 just here in the U.S. So this is, more than both World War I and II combined. This was a major event. And if you put it sort of in context of all the different infections that one might have, which is what this slide is, what the red line there goes back, I don't know exactly what the time frame is, 1900, I guess, when it starts. That's deaths from any kind of infection, any kind of typhoid, any kind of flu, anything. And you can see this nice downward slope of infectious deaths over time with this one very notable peak, and that's the 1918 flu pandemic. So it totally dwarfed all other infectious causes of death combined. And that's, of course, always the fear now with the future pandemics is they really have the potential to completely devastate a population. So in preparation for this and for next week, I did dig up a couple of old North Carolina specific journals, accounts of the flu, and this was one that I thought was interesting. Didn't foresee how bad my vision would be when I came up with this idea. But this was a doctor who was speaking at the North Carolina Medical Society meeting in Pinehurst the year after the flu pandemic had just ended. So there it is. That's better. So you can see it's beyond the power of man to adequately express, even in part, that which has taken place since we last gathered here. Never before has a year so pregnant with momentous results passed across the dial of time. So that's apparently people were much more eloquent back then. But that gives you some flavor. So in thinking about this and in thinking about being here in this location, the metaphor that came to my mind for our understanding of flu was the monarch. And probably shouldn't be talking about monarchs in this place because I don't know much, but the connection is, we know a lot about monarchs. We know that they have these amazing migrations and that over multiple generations they find the same exact tree, year after year, and somehow they find their way all the way back down to Mexico, even though their great-great-grandparents hadn't even been there. So we know all these things, but ultimately we don't really know much about it at all. We don't know why. We don't know how. And that's sort of like flu. Flu has been with us forever, but we really don't know that much about it ultimately. We know it makes you sick. We know it happens in the winter, but we don't know why. We don't know when it's going to peak. We don't know why it peaks early, why it peaks late. We don't know why it's severe some years. We don't know why one virus comes along and kicks out the one that was there before it. Why can't they both just still be around? There's a lot of mysteries. So again, the more eloquent people from back in the day, Dr. Edward Wood had an article in the Charlotte Medical Journal right after the pandemic that I thought he had a lot of self-reflection, maybe more than most scientists today. To us, our own time is the wisest of all ages in things medical. Every age has the same inflated ideas as the importance of its own accomplishments. Or put in a more modern phrasing, sit down, be humble. I think it's important for us to recognize that, in terms of all flu knowledge, we know very, very little. We have a lot. If you think of where we were in 1918 and where we are in 2018, we're not that far along, but it's not to say there hasn't been progress. So one of the areas where there has been some progress is our overall understanding of the virus. And of course, in 1918, they didn't know it was a virus. That was the first problem. This quote here from the same guy in Charlotte Medical Journal: "The cause of the disease is an appalling, if not paralyzing, mystery." That's where they were then. They thought it was the Haemophilus influenza bacterium, which it was not. Just left us with some bad, confusing names for bacteria. So 2018, we know a lot about the virus. We can do the whole genome sequence of the virus. We know everything about all the surface proteins and what they do, and we know what all the gene segments do. So I don't mean to undersell our flu knowledge. We have a tremendous amount of flu knowledge now. that we didn't before. So the next comparison in my sort of then and now, I've got a couple of these, was in terms of surveillance, what we were able to do, and that's my job, that's what we do. So this is the area that I care most about and hope you ask me questions about, is how we actually track the flu. And this was how they were going about it. In 1918, Dr. Bulla, who was the health director in Winston-Salem, North Carolina at that time, has asked physicians to report all cases of influenza for inclusion in his weekly report. So that's actually, you know, not that different. We still ask doctors to report some things, but now we have a very comprehensive, ongoing, year-round surveillance system. We're part of it here in North Carolina. We're tuned into a whole global network, so it's really quite sophisticated, and it gives us wonderful data and graphs like this one. I'm sure that you all, every Thursday, go and read our new weekly flu report at flu.nc.gov, so thank you for that. But this kind of tells us how our season looks this year compared to other years, and the red is the line of this year, activity this year. And you can just kind of see, not even knowing what these numbers mean, that it's worse. It was higher than the past 2 seasons. This tells us, you know, how severe our season is, how widespread it is. And we get these data from a variety of sources that I can go into later. We also track deaths. We're actually the only state, to my knowledge, in the country that has influenza-associated deaths as a legally reportable condition. So by law, physicians are supposed to report to us if they believe someone has died of flu. That's probably news to any of you who might be physicians, but that's the law. So we get, you know, we are able to track flu deaths, and this is this year again. This is today's report. I think we're up to 342 deaths that were reported, and that's a very tip of the iceberg thing, because of course reporting is very, very incomplete. But it does allow us to compare to previous seasons and to see who's dying. And in this case, this year, it's people over 65, which I could have told you going into this year that it was going to be people over 65, because it was the particular flu virus that was predominating is one that, you know, you can make those kind of predictions. But this is the kind of data that we get routinely. And that's us here in North Carolina. But like I said, we're part of this whole global flu surveillance network that's ongoing 24/7, and collecting viruses, looking at what's going around. And there's a few different things that we want to look for. Number one is just to know which flu viruses are going around. That helps us know who's going to be hit the hardest. We want to test and see if it's a good match or a bad match. You can ask me questions about vaccine match. That's a whole thing. But that's, you know, we test viruses for that. We want to know about resistance to antivirals. And I can tell you that as someone who's been doing this for a long time, when I look at the CDC's flu report, that's the very first thing I turn to every week is the flu resistance, because that's where our big problems are going to come from if we lose our flu drugs. And then most important for this talk and this topic is that we look for new viruses. We're looking for the next virus that could be the next pandemic, and that's really the big point. So what does it mean to be a pandemic? Well, there's 3 requirements really, but there's really only 2, because the third one is inevitable if you hit the first 2. So the first one is that you have a new virus, and most of the population is susceptible. That's number 1. And we have that. I'll show you in just a second. We have a lot of novel viruses out there. The second is that it becomes transmissible from person to person, and that's actually abbreviated. It's sustained person-to-person transmission. That's the deal breaker. That's the difference between all those weird flu viruses that are affecting us and many other animals and a pandemic, because once you have sustained person-to-person transmission, there's no stopping it. It's a pandemic. It's going to become global. So this slide just shows you the way that CDC has come up with to track some of these novel or new or weird flu viruses that are out there and look at their potential to cause a pandemic and their potential to cause, you know, a 1918 type pandemic. And on the vertical axis is the severity, basically how fatal are they when people get it. Is it 50% fatal? Is it 10%? And then on the y-axis is emergence. How is it, are we seeing a lot more human infections? Is it spreading around poultry, et cetera? So this gives you sort of a risk. Which ones are we most worried about? Actually, might want to use that thing that they showed me. Oh, look at that. It's the fancy pointer. So the ones that are up here These are the ones that we're most worried about. Those are the ones that are the most lethal, the most likely to emerge as the next pandemic, and these actually all happen to be a virus called H7N9 that's been circulating for several years in China, causing problems, but has not become sustained human-to-human transmission. So we're most worried about that, but kind of history shows us it's usually we're worried about that, and then it ends up being one of these down here. So it's just a way for us to the point being that we're constantly monitoring for these new viruses. Okay, so vaccine. Obviously, things have changed from 1918 to now in terms of vaccine, in that there was no vaccine. If you don't know what causes the infection, that's going to make it hard. 2018, we're very fortunate. We have several formulations of flu vaccine available to us now. Hopefully, you all received it. I did. But there are limitations still. There's delays in vaccine production. If we had a new pandemic virus today, it'd probably take us, the planning estimate is 4 to 6 months until we had enough vaccine out there to actually get to the population. The goal is 3 months. That's still a pretty long time. We got close to that actually in 2009, but it's a long time. And as you all know, it's incompletely effective, and this got a lot of discussion, at least in the circles that I run in this year, about flu vaccine effectiveness. This is not 100%. This is not some, measles, hepatitis A. We got some really good ones out there. This one's a little bit weaker. But this is the game changer. This is the big difference between where we are now versus where we were in 1918. So, there's several huge benefits that we get from this. First of all, preventing millions of illnesses, tens of thousands of hospitalizations, can reduce a child's risk of dying. It can probably reduce in adults, but there's actually now a pretty solid study with the kids showing that it does reduce the risk of death among children. It can protect the people around you, along with just yourself. And even if you do get sick, having had a vaccine can make the illness milder. So this is the real game changer. This is the big, I would say, biggest thing between those two time periods. Then there's medical treatment, just to give you a sense of where things stood in 1918 from the Charlotte Medical Journal. Cold rectal irrigations proved to be useful antipyretics, and prolonged hot irrigations of the auditory meatus, that's your ears, are good for earache. So, and there's lots of great pictures that you can Google and pull up of all the different flu treatments that were out there. These are just a couple. Onions. The onions might have worked. Yeah, maybe. I'm not knocking it. I'm just saying we might have a little bit of an advance now. So obviously there were no antiviral medications because they did not know it was a virus. 2018, again, we have come some ways, but we have a long ways to go. We have exactly one class of drugs that are approved against the currently circulating flu viruses, and that is not where you want to be with a rapidly mutating RNA virus. We're only one mutation away from having antiviral resistance at any given point in time, and we've seen it here in North Carolina. It's happened elsewhere, so this is worrisome. But we do have antivirals. We do have a strategic national stockpile, which we coordinate from over here, that if there were a pandemic, those drugs could be made available to lessen the severity. And then also supportive care. There's a lot of discussion that probably what killed people in 1918 was not necessarily just flu infections, but there was a lot, there was a total lack of supportive care, and plus there was a lot of secondary bacterial infections that happened. So, they had cold rectal irrigations. They recommended sunshine lemonade, which is good. We have ventilatory support. We got ventilators. That's actually another part of our planning that I'll talk about. We have things like ECMO, which is a much more advanced thing for people who are failing on ventilators. We can keep them alive until they can start to heal. And then, of course, we have a wide array of antibiotics that can treat those secondary infections that are so deadly. And then there's what we call non-pharmaceutical interventions. That's aside from the drugs, what do we do to prevent things? Well, in 1918, you can see, this is actually from here in North Carolina, public gatherings prohibited, beginning on October 5th. This was right at the beginning of the second wave, the big wave that killed so many people that started in Wilmington and kind of spread west across the state. And this is a poster that I really like from a movie theater in Chicago that's got some messages that still resonate. Basically, if you think you're sick, stay home. No spitting and coughing in the theater. If you can't stop spitting and coughing, please leave. I like to compare that to our current messages, and that's pretty much what we're saying right now too. So some things are different, some not so much. This is another quote from one of the Winston-Salem newspapers in 1918. Ministers are asked to warn the people against careless spitting and coughing. So now, those messages are the same, and I say these things all the time. Just the basic, cover your coughs and sneezes, stay home from school and work when you're sick, wash your hands. Those haven't changed. So it's really not that different. But we do have some, some other tricks up our sleeve for the non-pharmaceutical interventions and things we can turn to, like isolation and quarantine. If we did have a new virus that was limited and we thought we could control it that way. And then closures were relied on heavily in 1918, school closures, et cetera. And that's something that we did here in 2009 on a limited scale and could do again. So not that different, really. And then the last sort of category that I was going to cover here is our public health infrastructure, where we were then and where we are now. And this is really going to be beyond me. But if anyone can see there, let's see. This was a telegram from our state health director that he sent to. Here, I'm just going to come down and read it. That he sent to the head of the U.S. Public Health Service on October 12, 1918. It says, Kannapolis, Cabarrus County, 6,000 or 7,000 people and only 3 doctors, 2,000 cases of influenza, doctors about exhausted, condition urgent and serious. Please have 3 nurses and 2 doctors sent at the earliest possible moment. That was from W.S. Rankin, our state health director, because there really was no public health infrastructure. There was the U.S. Public Health Service, and then you can kind of tell from his later quotes what the response was. He basically said in less than a week, the U.S. Public Health Service and the American Red Cross were swamped with appeals from all parts of the country. They threw up their hands in despair and admitted their inability to supply the urgent appeals for help. So that's kind of what public health was at that time: send doctors, send nurses, and that, and this, it was actually interesting. We did have a state board of health, but we did not have a state health department, so there were no people, actually doing the work. We did not have very many local health departments, although we are advanced in that way in North Carolina. We did have some, among the first in the country, but there was a lot of resistance among doctors about having local health departments, and the flu really changed all that. The flu pandemic changed all that. They suddenly realized, oh, it might not be so bad for us to have people who were dedicated to dealing with this type of thing. But at that time, they had just started a Bureau of Epidemiology 1 year before the flu epidemic hit, which I'm sympathetic to. I started my job 1 year before the 2009 pandemic. I'm not saying it's the same thing, but I can sort of have a sense of it. But there really wasn't much out there. So it's a different situation. I'm pleased to report today that we do have a coordinated public health infrastructure that operates at all levels. We have our local health departments in all 100 counties who are working closely with us on these things. We at the state level do a lot of coordination. Of course, we have the CDC, we have the World Health Organization, and everybody's got their plans and coordination and exercising those plans. So what is a pandemic preparedness plan? Not something you want to hear about in detail, I can tell you, although it's good to have. But it covers a lot of things. Incident management. How do we relate to the CDC? How do we relate to WHO around these things? How do we deal with our counties? How do we deal with our partners in agriculture, the hospitals, et cetera? Surveillance, laboratory surveillance. How are we going to handle that? How are we going to get ability to test for these new viruses and scale that up so doctors can have access to it? Non-pharmaceutical interventions that we talked about. Medical countermeasures is huge. I mentioned a little bit the strategic national stockpile. How do we get vaccines delivered, made and delivered as promptly as possible, try to shorten that window. How do we get the antivirals, the diagnostic tests, the ventilators, et cetera. Medical response and surge capacities. We work very closely with our Office of Emergency Medical Services and Hospital Preparedness Program. And there will be people talking about that at the Going Viral. And then communications and public information, of course, is key. And that was believed to be one of the big deficits in 1918. There was a lot of information that was either not truthfully or not promptly delivered that maybe could have helped people to prepare themselves a little better. So this is just a taste of kind of what's going on at all levels of public health behind the scenes. I can tell you we've got tabletop exercises planned for June for all 100 health departments to try their plans, look for issues. So, and we have some sort of frameworks that CDC has put out that help us do that work. This is what they call the intervals of a flu pandemic. I really do need glasses. But this is just tells you where you are, this way, where you are in terms of there is no pandemic. There's some viruses we're worried about. Uh-oh, we've got one that's now got sustained person-to-person transmission. So now it's starting to increase, and this is during the pandemic, and then as it starts decelerating. So all of our plans are written to these intervals. So we do different things for surveillance. We do different things for medical countermeasures depending on where we are in this flow. And then lastly, we have sort of another framework that helps us to guide our response is the Severity Framework that CDC came out with, that basically what we do for responding to a pandemic depends. Is it up here and the more severe and more widespread? This is the 1918 scenario. Is it a milder pandemic? That really affects what we do, where we put our resources and energy. So there's a lot more behind this, but this just to give you a sense of some of the things that we consider as we're making those decisions. Okay, so that's it for pandemics, and I just wanted to leave you with going back to regular old seasonal influenza, because that's what we deal with all the time. And I think people don't tend to appreciate, we do worry a lot about pandemics, as we should, but I think people sort of don't appreciate the impact that annual flu has. It's just something that we've all gotten kind of used to. So every year in the United States, we're talking about somewhere between 9.2 and 35.6 million cases. Hundreds of thousands of hospitalizations. This is just routine, regular old flu seasons, and tens of thousands of deaths that are occurring. And again, the old-timers said it the best, I think. This Dr. Edward Wood from the Charlotte Medical Journal, influenza brings to light a strange mental makeup of humanity. If a few thousand men are killed in battle, the whole nation goes into mourning. While within the last year, nearly 500,000 of lives have been lost through influenza without the least show of emotion. And I think that's, that's apropos. That's, we look at all of our other communicable diseases, even now, 342 deaths this year from flu. That's more than we've had from any of the others out there, but I think it's people just accept it as a fact of life, unfortunately. So that's my last take home is where we've come. Back in 1918, scientific writing was much better. Unfortunately, we've fallen a long way. I love reading those old journals. Okay, that's all I had prepared. I was told to leave lots of time for questions, so hopefully I did, and I'm happy to answer any you have.
Let's give him a round of applause. Thank you very much. All right, so yes, now we're going to do audience Q&A. I have a mic, Katie has a mic. We'll go around, wave us down when you've got a question. I see a few hands up already. Katie's already got one. But we'll bring the mics around, so that way we can all share the same microphones. First question.
Get right up in there.
Okay, I actually have two questions, one short, one maybe unanswerable. We always hear of the names like H7N9 or whatever. What does the H and the N mean? That's the first question.
I can answer that one. Good. So it was actually one of the pictures I showed at the beginning. There's some of the surface proteins that the flu has. One is called hemagglutinin, and one is called neuraminidase. And the hemagglutinin is basically involved with binding to the receptors on our cells or on animal cells or whatever. And neuraminidase is one that allows the virus to be released from the cells. So the different hemagglutinin types, different neuraminidase types get that H7N9, and the big point is there's something called shift when we have like a new hemagglutinin, sometimes also with a new neuraminidase, then we get a novel virus, a new virus, and that's when we...
So is it limited, those numbers are always low, is it limited to like 100 different combinations?
Yeah, that's one that I should know. I think there's maybe 9 hemagglutinin and some low number of teens neuraminidase. So there's lots of different combinations out there. And the viruses, of course, this is only influenza A. Influenza B, we don't talk about H and N because we don't get shift. Only influenza A infects pigs and infects birds, and that's what allows for all the mixing of these viruses and the creation of these new ones. So it's just A, and there are many combinations, and if you look it up, there's certain ones that infect horses mostly, and certain ones that infect ducks, and certain ones, so it's depends.
Okay, that was a broader answer than I was expecting, so I'm going to skip the second question.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. I wouldn't have known the answer to the second one anyway.
All right, thank you for the presentation. That was great. It's my understanding that most of the novel flu viruses start in China. Why particularly China, and why don't new reservoirs of virus crop up? Once this thing has spread around the world, why doesn't it form a new reservoir that can reinfect people for years and years to come?
I can answer the first part. Well, and I'm not sure that our pandemic viruses really do come from China predominantly. We certainly do have a lot of novel viruses that do come from China, and it has to do with the way that people interact, particularly with poultry and particularly with waterfowl in China, and pigs are the other part of the equation. But there's a lot more opportunities for mixing between humans and poultry and waterfowl and pigs in China. So there's a lot more opportunities for new viruses to pop up. I think that, the 1918 virus was called Spanish flu. It probably came from here, is the current thinking. Our last 2009 H1N1 pandemic also probably came from here, but we don't name them U.S. virus or American virus. We had the Russian virus, we had the Hong Kong flu, we had the, but when it happens here, we call it H1N1. So I don't know that they deserve the reputation entirely, but they do. There are a lot of opportunities for mixing.
I have 2 questions. One is, how do antivirals like Tamiflu work? And the second one is, I had a bad cold and I thought it was a flu, and I had chills and fever, and they did this nose swabby thing, which I understand the accuracy is not high, but what's the accuracy between that one and the better one?
Yeah, so for the first one, the antivirals, it gets back to that, and the neuraminidase that allows, there's only one class, like I said, they're called neuraminidase inhibitors. So the neuraminidase is what, after the virus replicates in the cell and it's ready to go spread, the neuraminidase breaks it off and lets it float free. So if you block the neuraminidase, the virus replicates, but then it can't leave the cell, so they're basically trapped. So that's how a neuraminidase inhibitor works. And then as far as the diagnostic tests, you're right. The rapid influenza test that you would get a result right there in the clinic, the sensitivity is low, so there's a lot of, they miss a lot. So we don't even recommend them when flu is circulating widely. Our guidance is to doctors is, if somebody's got consistent symptoms, treat them like it's flu, whatever that means for you. Give them a drug, don't give them a drug, but just treat it like it's flu, because we hate to see, especially in our flu death data, when we look into those cases that they came in and they were tested for flu, but it was negative, and so they weren't treated, and we don't like to see that. So the sensitivity is not good. It's on the order of 50 to 70% for those tests, compared to some of the better tests that are really not available widely, like the PCR tests and the culture and stuff.
Why does flu affect? Here we are.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Why does flu affect people so badly? In fact, kill so many people.
Yeah, and there's several different ways you can die from the flu, and of course, the vast majority of people who have flu do fine. It's just miserable for a couple days, and then you're fine. Flu itself can cause a viral, a lung infection, a pneumonitis, or can, a tracheobronchitis can flu itself just infects your airways, and that in and of itself can become very severe and can be fatal. So you can get just a viral pneumonia with flu that kills you. A combination of the infection and your body's immune response. There's also there's lots of other ways that flu can kill you. There's secondary bacterial infections. So you get infected with the flu, your respiratory tract is all beat up, and all the normal bacteria that have been living in your nose and throat for a long time can suddenly get into places that they aren't supposed to be, and they can get into your lungs, they can get into your bloodstream, so you can die from those secondary bacterial infections. And then there's a lot of other stuff, getting back to all that we don't understand. Flu actually leads to cardiac events also, even in people who didn't have any kind of overwhelming flu-like illness. It can increase your risk of having other kinds of fatal outcomes.
And can you say a little bit about the kind of more at the cellular level, why flu has these very bad effects that other viruses don't?
Well, and of course, some other viruses do. It's a lot. It's it's that triad of the pathogen and the host and the environment that. Why some people end up with a real severe infection, I couldn't exactly tell you. One issue is where the flu viruses bind, and you have some that bind preferentially to the upper respiratory tract and might cause milder illnesses. You have ones like H7N9 that have adapted to bind more to the lower respiratory tract and cause pneumonia, and those are flu viruses that are going to be associated with a higher case fatality rate. So there's some of those kinds of things that can make one flu virus worse than another. That probably doesn't exactly answer your question, but maybe it's in the ballpark. Okay.
Hi. One of the questions I have is, back in the 17 and 1800s, bloodletting was very popular.
Mm-hmm.
So we got rid of hemoglobin there. So now you're telling us that during the 1918 epidemic, we were giving people colonics to clear out the GI tract. So we start getting dehydrated and the like. Why did they go for those colonics and do it so frequently? They did hot and cold ones. So.
Well, the cold ones was in the ear, but the hot ones was in the ear, and the cold one, and I certainly don't claim to be an expert in that treatment methodology. I'm not an expert in any treatment methodology, but that was for fever. They were, This was actually a description of what was happening on board military ships. So you can imagine that these were not wonderful conditions, but that's what they were doing for soldiers to reduce their fever, was basically ice water, colonics. So it wasn't for any sort of curing any kind of infection. It was just for a fever reducer. Yeah. Dehydration is a big problem, obviously, too, with anything that causes a fever. It's important to make sure, and that's another leg up that we have now in terms of managing the overall patient. We can keep people healthy with severe infections through adequate hydration, through adequate ventilation, et cetera. We can do a lot to support people that we couldn't do then.
So this question relates more to the pandemic portion of your talk. I was associated with the school system prior to 2010, and I think it must have been when people began to be nervous about bird flu. I think that was the one, I can't remember. And somebody came in and gave a presentation, and it was utterly eye-opening and sort of terrifying. And what I remember most about it was not so much the medical sort of disease implications, but the systemic implications of a big, massive pandemic. And so what they were trying to help an organization like that deal with was, how do you keep vital functions up and running when people can't communicate with everybody in the system, and people can't get paid, and a significant critical number of people don't show up for work, and that sort of thing. Is that some of what you do as well? And do you have more sophisticated ways of helping organizations deal with that today than you did perhaps a couple of decades ago?
It's some of what we do, but it's also some of what the school systems do, and what the every branch of government has their own what they call continuity of operation plans that has a part in it about a pandemic type situation where you fall below critical mass with your personnel, or people can't come into work. So to a large extent, each group, each industry is sort of on their own in terms of coming up. You know, we help them with understanding what we would expect with the flu pandemic and how long it would last, and making those assumptions, but then they have to make their own plans for their own school system about how they're going to function if that were to happen. And actually, just quick little anecdote I ran across in one of those Winston-Salem newspapers. There was a professor at Salem College in 1918 who arranged with the phone company to conduct her classes remotely and have them patch in her students, which may be the first instance of a of a conference call. I'm not sure, but I thought that was really cool that came about because of the pandemic, and they said no classes can meet, and she said, well, I'm going to see what I can do about that. So, yeah.
Yeah. Next question is that, like, I know that 1980 flu is somewhat so-called the Spanish flu.
Yes.
In that flu, most of the people die because of the streptococcus pneumonia, bacterial infections. So the 1918 flu strain is same as somewhat 2009 H1N1 flu strain. But in that case, like compared to that death, least people are die. So is that somewhat related to that? So-called the vaccination, because of the vaccinations, pneumonia infection is like suppress the growth of the pneumonia, or something is related to vaccine, or what? I don't understand. Like, I cannot correlate with this two, like 1980 flu and 2009, both are same, but why do not people have the streptococcus pneumonia infections in 2009? Like, why, like?
Well, there's a couple of things. One is that they're not the same, and that brings to light a problem with the way that we name flus with the H1N1, because the H1N1 from 1918 is an entirely different virus than the H1N1 from 2009, and also an entirely different virus from the other H1N1 that we had before. In between, we had a different H1N1, and yeah, it's enough to make you crazy. So they're not the same virus. So they have different fundamental intrinsic virulence just within the virus. But you're totally correct that bacterial infections are believed now to be a large part of the deaths that occurred. Not all, because a lot of the descriptions you read, particularly among the military, are people like getting sick and dying within a couple of hours, which is really not consistent with a secondary bacterial infection. That's probably just an overwhelming viral infection and your body's response to the virus. And I don't think anyone's ever going to know exactly what proportion, but it was certainly a lot of bacterial deaths, and strep pneumo is a common cause of, and so that was a major player there. We do have vaccinations now against pneumococcus, both in the childhood series when they get their Prevnar, and then there's older ones for adults that they get later in life. Whether those vaccinations played any role in limiting secondary bacterial infections, probably so. They probably do every year. 2009 was a mild to moderate pandemic, but those vaccinations are really important during a normal flu season at protecting people from secondary bacterial infections as well.
So it may be possible that in 2009, people used to take like vaccination, like not the monovalent, trivalent, or tetravalent, like Brisbane, Hong Kong, H3N2 mixed strain of the vaccines, or maybe one of that reason, I'm not sure, just like.
You mean the
survival rates of the people in 2009 H1N1 flu, maybe because of the tetravalent and the trivalent vaccines?
You mean the flu vaccines?
Yeah.
Yeah, and the flu vaccine, you know, at the time it felt like it was taken forever, but it was about 4 months, I believe, maybe 4 or 5 months before it was widely available, a specific H1N1 vaccine. It was too late to sort of mix it into the normal flu vaccine because that had already been in production, so they had to come up with a monovalent vaccine, which definitely, like I said, that's the game changer vaccine. that definitely prevented a lot of illness and death from that pandemic, for sure.
Thank you.
Oh, yeah.
Hey,
Hello.
how are you?
Good. How you doing?
Kind of nervous.
Come on up.
I just have a really dumb question. I have diabetes, and my doctor is constantly getting on me about getting my flu shot. And I know when I get sick, it's a little worse than the average person. My liver tries to pump sugar into my system, make me better. Blood sugar spikes. Why is, short of the flu being the flu, why was it so much worse for me?
I knew when you said stupid question that I wasn't going to know the answer. That's like so diabetes is one of those, as you probably well know, that puts you at risk for a lot of infections, a lot of viral infections, and a lot of bacterial infections. And I have a little better knowledge on the bacterial front of why specifically with that, but I don't think I could tell you, the mechanism why flu, there's alterations in the immune system. Generally, that's sort of a, catch-all answer among people with diabetes that impact how they respond to an infection. So it's one of many high-risk conditions: lung diseases, heart diseases, some kind of metabolic diseases, anything that affects your ability to, anything that affects your lung volume, like pregnant women are at higher risk for severe infection. People with things like cerebral palsy, where they, so there's a whole lot of things. Diabetes is one where it does put you at increased risk, and it is especially important both to get the vaccine and to contact your doctor or seek medical care if you think you have the flu, because antivirals are really important in those groups. But as far as the specific reason for diabetes being a risk factor for flu, I probably knew if you asked me 12 years ago when I was doing fellowship, but couldn't tell you now. So the question is, should someone with a high-risk condition immediately seek care if they think they have those symptoms? Ideally not. We don't want everyone with flu to go into a healthcare setting, especially an emergency department, and then sit there and share it with people. The best thing to do, if you have the option, is call your doctor. A lot of people don't have a doctor, and for them, yeah, that's probably the best thing to do. But if you have the option to call, there's a lot of doctors' offices that are willing to do triage over the phone, and even that can lead to a prescription without having to send you anywhere.
Maybe you answered this question and I missed it, but do we know in North Carolina of the 340 some deaths that were flu related, how many had been vaccinated of that group?
Get that question a lot, so we do know. I don't know for the 342, but I know for last week, whatever number that was, and I want to say it was on the order of 40% of the people who of those cases had been vaccinated, and the rest were either unvaccinated or we had no documentation that they were vaccinated. So it's really hard to take that number. Reporters want that all the time, and I always have a lot of trepidation because I think it's hard to compare. What they want to do is compare that number to the overall vaccination in the population and say, look, it was a higher vaccination rate among the deaths. It's clearly not helping anybody, but the complicating factor there is that the people who died of flu, many had, or most, had identifiable high-risk conditions that put them at higher risk. So it's not really a fair comparison to look at the vaccination rate in them compared to the vaccination rate in the general population, because unfortunately, although the vaccines are especially important for people at high risk, they also are going to not be as effective at preventing infections in some of those groups. So it's really hard to compare population-wide vaccination coverage to vaccination coverage among people who died of flu. But it is about 40%. I'm not sure what it is this week, but that's what it's been running this year.
Well, this year's vaccine was predicted early on to be less effective. And why Why is that, and how does its effectiveness compare to previous years?
How much time do we have? No. So we don't know yet. We have interim vaccine effectiveness estimates that are from the first part of the season. So we know a little bit, and we know that the overall effectiveness was about 36%, which means, put into more useful terms, that getting the flu shot was prevented about 1/3 of flu infections. It was lower for the main virus that was causing trouble this year with the H3N2 virus, influenza A, H3N2. Effectiveness was lower against that particular virus. That's the same virus that was the main virus last year, and flu vaccine effectiveness this year was pretty much the same, or the interim estimate is that it was pretty much the same as last year. There was a lot of chatter because there were studies done in Australia that showed a lower vaccine effectiveness. You know, we go back and forth. Obviously, Southern Hemisphere had just finished their season when ours was starting. They did their study and it was 10% effective. But they don't have a universal flu vaccine recommendation in Australia. They only vaccinate high-risk people. So again, unfortunately, high-risk people are high risk, and it's not going to be as effective in that group. So we and people at CDC were always a little skeptical about those kind of early gloom and doom predictions. Now, 36% is not great. We would love 100%. And, you know, there's a million different factors that go in. It's incredibly nuanced and complicated why a vaccine is more or less effective against a certain virus. But overall, we have a long way to go in terms of our vaccine effectiveness. The dream, H3N2, it's never as good. It's always better against the H1N1 viruses, always better against B. The dream is that we'll have a vaccine one day that will be effective against all flu viruses, and it will give us lasting immunity, and you can just give it with your childhood immunization series, and then you're done. That's where we need to be, but you know, I don't know when that's ever going to happen.
Yeah, you basically just answered my question about a universal type flu shot. So I guess I could ask, do you feel like they are putting enough, the government puts enough money towards this for the likelihood of that occurring anytime soon? Is there enough money?
I don't know, because I'm not in the vaccine research world. I'm sure if you asked a vaccine researcher, they would tell you no. This can't be the only room in RTP without a flu vaccine researcher. Where are you? No? Wow, okay. There's a lot of work going on, and there is a lot of money in it. I'm sure that more would be appreciated, but it's not. We're focused on sort of the tracking the flu, the getting the prevention messages out, so I don't really have any detailed knowledge. There's all kinds of promising stuff, and you'll hear on the news, they'll talk about some new flu vaccine. They call them backbone vaccines. Means they target the backbone of the virus, not just one feature that's going to change, and it never pans out, but I'm always hopeful.
I'm going to let you off the hook. I don't have a question.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you.
However, 6 or 7 years ago, there was published a very interesting book called The Great Influenza, and I don't remember the name of the author, but it sets up before, during, and after the 1918 pandemic. I really recommend it. Very, very interesting reading, even if you're not a clinician or a scientist, because everything is explained very well.
Yeah, I have not read it, but someone was supposed to bring it to me last week, actually, so I'll remind him.
I actually have two questions. My first one is, what dictates flu season? As you said, it transfers kind of from the southern hemisphere to the northern hemisphere. Does it have to do with temperature or what? The other one is, why, when some people get the vaccine, do they start to feel the symptoms of the illness? Is it actually the illness, or?
So the first one gets back to my Monarch analogy. We know what happens, we don't really know why it happens, and you hear all the time, we were actually discussing beforehand, oh, it's because kids go back to school and they're all close together, or it's cold outside and we're all in small spaces, and that's, you know, kids go back to school in September, flu doesn't usually hit until January, December, so that doesn't really hold much water. And, why do we get the same strains usually that were circulating in the southern hemisphere? We model our vaccine after that because we know that's likely to be what comes up. How does that happen? Is it some plane load of Australians that are coming up every year that are just like spreading it? And if that was the case, why wouldn't it just start here and spread? Why is it everywhere at once? These are mysteries, and I don't have an answer. I do have an answer to your second question, which is why can you get flu-like illness when you get a flu vaccine? The main thing that people get when they get a flu vaccine is the soreness, and some people do get like that kind of feverishness. Not actually, it doesn't, well, it can, but it's unusual to have actual fever as a result of the vaccine. The vaccines don't actually cause flu. All the vaccines this past year, unfortunately, were the killed or inactivated vaccines. There is a live vaccine, a nasal one, that I think is probably going to be coming back, but it was not recommended last year because it proved ineffective in previous seasons. That one is live, but it's attenuated, which means it can only survive in the colder temperatures of the nose, and then your body forms your immune response to that, but it can't survive any deeper down, so it doesn't cause flu illness. The other big reason why people get sick after they get the flu shot is because people get sick, whether they get the flu shot or not. And if you're giving millions of flu shots every year, there are going to be some people who get their flu shot on Wednesday and get sick on Thursday. And, that's just life. And it's really hard to convince a person who got their flu shot on Wednesday and got sick on Thursday that those two things are not related. But we do have, many years and millions of doses of experience to back that up. Yes.
So I've always wondered, so first of all, that was a great presentation. And secondly, sorry, I just had a brain dump.
That's because the presentation was so good.
So is there a specific thing that triggered the 1918 epidemic? Like, did it come from the trenches in the war, or did it just start out of nowhere?
Well, and the person who just read that book probably has a better sense of this, but yes, the war definitely played a role in helping it to spread around, and unfortunately that was a virus that targeted young adults. I just mentioned that, or maybe I did, 2/3 of our deaths this year in people over 65. That's the virus that we have now. That H1N virus was one that targeted younger adults, and you had a lot of mobilized military around the world. So that almost certainly did both facilitate spread and give you a very sort of high-risk population in close concentration. Now, that doesn't explain where it came from, and I just read an article where they were theorizing actually Kansas maybe is where it came from, and they had a lot of pigs in this town, and they have flyways of waterbirds that go overhead regularly, and they had a military base, and that was where the first military outbreak was. So maybe that's, the origins aren't clear, but the military connection certainly played a role.
Hi, thank you. Little off topic, do you know of what progress is being made on generating these vaccines in a faster method? Something that would happen in less than 4 to 6 months so we could respond better and produce it faster?
I know a little bit. So that flu vaccines are still by and large grown in chicken eggs, and it's old school. They're literally taking some virus, cutting open a little chicken egg and sticking it in there and let it grow in the chicken egg until there's enough virus, and then they take that out and they purify it and inactivate it, and that's how vaccines are made. And that takes a long time, and it causes other problems, like it can actually affect vaccine effectiveness. So now there are cell cultures, which is one way to try to grow them faster, and that's actually some work. There's a plant in Holly Springs that does that. They do a cell culture-based vaccine, and that has potential to speed up the time. You still have to grow the virus in culture, and then there's these other technologies called recombinant technologies where they don't actually have to grow the virus in culture at all. They can basically create these cells that just spit out the protein that you need for the vaccine, which would be a much faster thing. And those are actually out there on the market already. And I think that the world is going to be moving towards these faster technologies, but you know, I don't know the time frame for all that happening. I think we're going to be having chicken egg vaccines for a while.
Well, let's give him one more round of applause. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. And of course, wash your hands, all of you. Thanks everybody for coming out to the Science Cafe. I hope you enjoyed tonight's program. The take home I have is that although flu sounds scary, pandemic is a very scary word in itself, I think we got good people working on it. So thanks to all of you for coming out tonight, learning and getting involved. We'll see you again here at the Science Trivia Night next Thursday. Yours truly is your quiz master. So bring your team, come out for Science Trivia next Thursday, 7 o'clock. Have a great weekend, everybody.